Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Yanna Krupnikov. I'm a professor of communication and media at the University of Michigan. Something that I study and often think about is how people understand politics and how they sift through all the different pieces of political information that seems to be coming at them. Which is why I'm really excited to talk to Adam Berinsky about his book, Political Rumors, Why We Accept Misinformation and How to Fight It. And here it is, backwards. Adam is the Mitsui Professor of Political Science at MIT, and he has spent the last decade researching what people do with political rumors. In his work, Adam has brought together surveys, experiments, and studies of information itself. Given his work, Adam has spoken and advised many different organizations, including members of the US, Finnish, and Swedish governments on this topic. So he is the perfect person to talk to about this, so let's get into it.
Great. Thank you.
Um, I am going to start with kind of an open, potentially basic question. But one really important challenge that you address in this book is really defining what is the concept of a political rumor. This is something that seems, incredibly deceptively simple, like we all rumor is. But it's something that is actually somewhat debated in research and actually even in popular discourse. So let's just start with that. What is your definition of a political rumor?
Yeah, that's great. So when I think about political rumors, I started this book back around 2009, 2010, and I had specific things in mind, which were basically thinking about Barack Obama's citizenship. Rumors, was he born in the US? Was he born in Kenya? Was he born in Indonesia? And it was just really interesting to me how these unsubstantiated pieces of information could circulate. And so when I think about political rumors and when I deal with it in the book, it's about these unverified pieces of information that circulate socially. And so there's this notion of the social transmission. So in this way, they're similar to things like urban legends or sort of other sorts of conspiracy theories there. But I think that the key is that these are pieces of information that circulate, that kind of get traction, but aren't necessarily backed by the kinds of evidence that we would want to think about when we think about political information. And that really gets us also to the notion of misinformation. So when I first started this project, political misinformation wasn't quite the hot topic that it has been over the last 15 years or so. But I think there's a lot of similarity there when we're thinking about sort of misinformation as unverified statements there. And so I think a lot of it gets at this question of, what is the authority that says that this is, this particular claim is supported by evidence or not? And who gets to decide that? So I think these are really critical questions that we need to think about.
Well, so I want to push on this definition just a bit more. One of the things you find in the book is that how we feel about the rumor. Is it about a party we dislike? Is it about a politician we like or dislike? Those feelings really shape whether we believe the rumor. And with that, I'm wondering to what extent these types of feelings and beliefs and who we like and don't like actually don't just shape whether we believe the rumor, but kind of shape whether we define something as a political rumor in the first place versus just saying, well, this is an exaggeration. It's not a rumor. It's not something that's untrue. So in particular, the book focuses, for example, on things that can be really demonstrably disproven. But in the context of politics, people talk about a lot of things that are kind of in a more ambiguous region. Like somebody might speculate about the worst version of where a political path leads us in the future, or they might emphasize certain statistical results and ignore others. How much do our beliefs and biases shape how we categorize this type of information? Are we more forgiving to the people on our side, maybe trying to find some grain of truth in what they're saying? Or are we being more forgiving in our evaluations of their motives for repeating things that actually are not true?
That's an excellent point, where, it's sort of when we think about politics, a lot of where you stand politically depends on where you sit politically, and how you look at the world depends on where you sit politically. So a lot of, sort of a lot of the information that we encounter, we filter through our political beliefs. Are we a Democrat or a Republican? So I should say that Jan and I were both trained at the University of Michigan in the political science department, where partisanship plays a huge role and in sort of thinking how people think about politics. And I think that that's true here. Now, I do think that, sort of in the book, as you mentioned, I really try to kind of get at these more excessive claims that really are completely unfounded by evidence. Part of that is, I think, twofold, right? One is that, as a social scientist, I like to deal with things that are relatively clean tests of, sort of seeing like, sort of how information flows. So, the notion that Barack Obama was not a US citizen, even though he's released both his short form birth certificate, the long form birth certificate, that there were ads in Hawaiian newspapers, when he was born. Basically, that there's such tremendous evidence, but yet there's still a large chunk of the American public. And so, especially, as you say, Republicans who are not willing to accept that this is fact, so to me, that really is a way to kind of get a handle on this, right? So thinking about the most extreme cases, like a really political misinformation or political rumors that a third of the public will accept. But it also cast an eye, as you say, on thinking about how information flows more generally, right? So that, sort of a lot of what politicians do is try to exaggerate, or they try to, sort of put the best spin on a particular piece of information. So is the economy doing well? Is the economy not doing well? What indicators do we look? So I think, this really gives us a window into this larger problem that we have about how can we have conversations about politics when citizens don't share the same reality. And I think, in the book, I really do want to kind of focus on these more extreme cases. So, right, not just rumors on the right, but rumors on the left as well. So, that George Bush stole the 2004 election because he was able to cook the voting machines in Ohio, right? So this is something that happened many years ago, but had a lot of traction at the time. Or the notion that the Russian government hacked into voting machines in 2016 and switched votes from Clinton to Trump, right? Again, there's no basis in fact for this, right? That there is evidence that the Russian government tried an information campaign, right, to try to help Trump in the contest against Clinton, but there's absolutely no factual basis at all for these other claims there. And the fact that these can circulate and these extreme stories can circulate among both Republicans and Democrats, kind of shows us that this is a really large problem. So not just, so why in my book I talk about political rumors, sort of that really related, as I said, to political misinformation, but also, relates to political exaggeration. And so I think that it is kind of looking at this larger window there.
Yeah, so you just mentioned kind of people and how people respond to it, and whether people choose to believe it. So let's actually talk about
Mhm.
these people and what they're up to. One of the really many interesting things about the book is a particular group of people who I think we actually don't think about all that much. But those are the people who say, when asked about political rumors, that they just don't know. Right.
Mhm.
So in surveys, some people might say, I believe this. Some people say, I definitely don't believe this. And then there's the don't knows. And
Mhm.
your book sort of points out that these don't knows are actually a really important group because they include a variety of different people, like people who are completely disengaged. They have no basis of knowing whether a rumor is true or untrue. And then there are people who are sort of genuinely unsure. They truthfully do not know. And
Mhm.
finally, there is this third group whom you identify as the skeptics, which is the people who you describe as the where there's smoke, there's fire people. They
Mhm.
are just unwilling to dismiss a rumor because they're kind of thinking if something's out there, there might be something behind that.
Mhm.
And in some ways, I think this group of skeptics is potentially the most interesting group because
Mhm.
this seems like a group of people who are basically inherently skeptical, maybe of a lot of things, but at least of politics. If people's feelings about political rumors are in some ways an outgrowth of some sort of skepticism about politics, is the solution correcting information about rumors, or is the solution kind of delving more deeply into where this skepticism comes from? So potentially thinking about why have people come to be so skeptical about politics that they're just unwilling to reject things that seem kind of untrue.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so I became interested, as I said, in these political rumors. Really, it kind of, the gateway was the believers. Sort of spending time looking at these, sort of internet chat boards, kind of see like how are people actually talking about this. But over the course of the project, discovered like there's another important group of people, as you said, these people who say that they don't know. So some people genuinely don't know. But other people, it's hiding, or by giving that response, they're really indicating like, maybe there's something here, right? And so, to do this in my survey work, I would ask people, here's a word: do you think Barack Obama is a U.S. citizen? Or do you think that that 9/11 was an inside job? And so I would ask people, do you believe this? Yes, no, or are you not sure? And then I would do a follow-up where I'd ask people, well, what was it that you read or saw or heard that led you to this conclusion? And the people who said that they believed that Obama was a U.S. citizen said, like, I saw the birth certificate. People who said that he wasn't, he's like, yeah, there's that birth certificate going around, but it's a fraud. And I read online that twins born in the same hospital on the same day have a birth certificate that looks completely different, or that typewriter font that is on that supposed birth certificate wasn't in use in the early 1960s. But then you also had people who said, like, I'm not sure. And if you ask them to follow up, they say, I wasn't really, sort of I was saying like, well, I've heard these things. I'm not really sure. So I don't know. Right. And so for me, I think like at a normative level, it's really important to focus on these folks as well, because these are people who aren't willing to accept the rumors, right? So these aren't the people who are deep into conspiracies, but they're not ready to reject them either, right? And so this notion of these folks sort of in the middle, right, who are neither acceptors nor rejectors is a really important group to focus on for a couple reasons. And one of them is, as you mentioned, thinking about, it's not just who these people are, but what they express. Because, it's not that people will say don't know to all of them. They might accept some, they might reject some, they might say don't know to some, but thinking about that response, right? If I ask you, here's a crazy political rumor, and you're not willing to reject it, then maybe I ask you about something else. You're like, oh yeah, that's crazy. That other thing doesn't make sense. But thinking about this is not just the type of person, but the type of response. As we're thinking about in a democracy, that if people who are, sort of skeptical about, they don't need to be skeptical about everything, but they're skeptical about some things, that's very dangerous. You can think about this also, sort of you mentioned that I did some work with the Finnish government. And so this was early on back in 2015. I talked to some government officials. I went over there, did some presentations, and we were talking about Russia Today, which was something that I was not aware of at the time. I have since become aware of. I know it's basically the propaganda arm of the Russian government externally facing. And they were telling me stories about, things that they had heard. So like basically, that the Russia Today was saying the Finnish government is taking babies from Russian nationals. So these were um, Russian citizens living in Finland, taking their babies to sell them to gay couples in America, right? And that's kind of crazy. So I told that story to different audiences where I present my work, and then I went back a couple of years later, and I said, I tell that story about the selling of the babies, like that's a great story. It's like, well, there's a new story now. It's not that the Finnish government is selling the babies; it's that the Finnish government is worried about repopulating the country because of low birth rates, so they're keeping the babies. It's like, well, you can't both sell the babies and keep the babies. But from the perspective of the Russian government, they don't care. They want you to basically not trust anything. And so I think that this is a really important thing, is not just that people are not sure whether or not to believe, these crazy rumors or misinformation. And, maybe it's only one or two. If I give you a list of 10 statements, say like, which of these do you believe? You're not sure. But basically, we're creating a situation where we shouldn't trust anything, right? And that's really the most dangerous thing. Not just creating people who are who react that way, but having different topics in politics that are framed in this particular way. It's like, well, I don't know who to believe. I don't know what to believe. I don't know what to trust.
Also, thinking about this idea of trust and kind of who we believe and what we believe and how we think about politics in general, I want to follow up on this relationship between how people respond to rumors, how people think about trusting, how people think about skepticism. I think in popular discourse, there is this belief that political rumors are a cause.
Mhm.
So, in theory, it works like this: if people believe these things, they are going to go and behave in certain ways, right? And so that really opens this implication um, that the rumors are the cause and the behavior is the symptom. I think the book opens a really interesting possibility, an argument that these beliefs in political rumors are not a cause, but rather they're a symptom. And I'm thinking here of Andy Guess's work, who is a researcher at Princeton, um, whose work you discuss in your book, which finds that the people who are most likely to share rumors, let's say on a social media platform, are the people who already believe these things, right? It's not necessarily that the rumor made them behave a certain way, it's that the rumor fits a set of things they already believe.
Yeah.
Um, in other words, the rumors aren't getting them there. Does considering support for political rumors as a symptom rather than the cause change how we think about these rumors or how we think about them in our political context?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And sort of talking about how I first came into this project, I was sort of naive back in 2009, 2010, thinking like, oh, this is really kind of crazy. I've studied mass political behavior, since I was an undergraduate in the 1980s and 90s, and so it's something I've thought about a long time. But hearing these rumors about death panels, about Obamacare, about 9/11 being an inside job, Obama's birthplace. And so like, even someone who studied political behavior for a long time thinking like this is really crazy. And so going in thinking like, all right, so this is right, these are political rumors. These are things that are not supported by evidence. So the solution, and I think that this was true at the time, how people thought about this, was that we want to go in and we want to present, rumors with facts. So correcting misinformation with true information. And so you could see this a lot kind of the with fact checkers at the time and kind of the role that they played. The things like Polyfact, things like Snopes.com, right? That these were organizations that were designed to say, you can send someone who says like, I believe this particular rumor. And so like, no, you should go to this website and you can say, here's the evidence. Basically, what we do is we fight misinformation with true information, that we fight fiction with fact. In this case, right, that it's very much thinking like that's the cause. Like, why do people support, or so why do people oppose the Affordable Care Act? It's because they think that there's death panels in there, right? So very much the cause and effect, as you said. But over time, realizing, it's not so much, it's not that you're playing whack-a-mole, right? So kind of like the carnival game where, things pop up and you whack them with hammers and you move to the next thing, right? It's just like basically there's moles everywhere and that whacking them isn't going to solve that problem. The thing about it is this general solution is this is how people engage with politics. So I don't trust politicians on the other side, or I don't trust the government at all. And so think about this as you said, as a symptom, not simply a cause. And, in many ways, that made the problem much harder and much more depressing, right? So they're thinking like, okay, if the problem is that there's bad information out there, what we need to do is to get good information. And we need to get good information by reputable sources, fact checkers, experts. And that once we correct that, then kind of democracy will correct itself. Right? But over time, it's clear that it's not the case that it's driven purely by bad information, right? It's also that people are more willing to believe, or, in the case of not sure, right? People say that they don't know, they're not willing to reject uh, particular beliefs on the basis of that information there. So, I think that you raise an excellent point, but also a really depressing point that, back when we thought that the problem was that misinformation, bad information is a cause, then the solution is that we need to get good information out there. But, as we've seen over the last, 15 years or so, that, that there's a lot of information that's out there that people don't want to accept. So, talk about like, think about fact checkers, right? So
Mhm.
if, if you have bad information and I say like, oh no, here's an authoritative source, here's a fact checker that says, here's the true information, you can either change your view of that information or you can change your view of that source, right? So thinking about, think about like I often when I'm talking about my work, thinking about like that relative at Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah that you're always trying to avoid because they always have some sort of crazy story there, right? And so, I won't say who it is in my family, but, there's someone that, I point to them to, Snopes.com, and I did this a few times. And this person said, that's great and all, you keep pointing me to Snopes.com, but all my friends tell me it's just liberal garbage, right? And so by reacting, you react to the true information or the supported information, not by altering your belief, as we thought, so if it's an informational story, but by altering how you feel about the authority figure there, right? And this also makes things much more difficult, sort of thinking about like it's a right? The notion that we can correct bad information with good information is a happy story in many ways, but also it means that we have a common set of beliefs about who gets to decide what's good information, what's bad information. And it's very clear in the current political climate that that's not the case. And so, thinking about the going in, thinking that this was a sort of typically, my projects have been about 5 years or so. So I was trained like a social psychologist. So, when I want to learn about something, I run some surveys to figure out, what do people believe? And I run experiments to see how I can correct that, right? And so back in 2009, I'm like, great, like I'll be done in a few years. I'll move on to the next thing. But here we are, right, in, 2025, more than 15 years after I started. And people say, "Well, how can we solve this problem?" I was like, "Well, um, it's really hard." And so I think it's really hard in large part because it isn't just about the information; it's about the identities that people bring to the experiences when they interact with the larger media system.
Although I want to know like literally everything about the relative at the holiday dinner, we're gonna get to that person actually a bit later. But I want to follow up on these ideas of the media and the role of the media first. In part because that seems like kind of a giant actor that's hanging out there that we're sort of talking about, but not yet.
Yeah.
So one of the big ideas in the book is the social transmission of political rumors. In the example kind of you just gave of the relative, right? It's their friends who are kind of telling them where to look for information. This idea of the social transmission, I think, also kind of naturally leads us to think of social media platforms.
Mhm.
In part because this is where a lot of people are getting information or at least kind of getting a social context.
Mhm.
How much do the affordances of social media, so the things we can do on social media, facilitate basically not just the spread, but also the belief in political rumors? In part because social media not just makes these rumors visible, so we can literally see it, but it also gives us a sense that people like us might believe, or at least like take a very charitable view toward a particular political rumor.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I should begin by saying that I have done paid work for Facebook, Google, and back when it was Twitter. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. That said, I think it is really important to think about, sort of social media as part of the, what we would call the information ecosystem more broadly. So thinking about how it is that people learn about politics. So, one thing I tell any audience that I talk to, and this is true of the people watching this now, is I would say, most people, most of the time, don't pay attention to politics, right? The fact that you are watching this now means that you're weird, right? Just as I tell my people who take my classes, it's like you're at MIT and you're taking a political science class, right? It's like, well, you need to take humanities, arts, and social sciences, but you could take econ, right? But you're taking political science because you like politics, right? You're a political junkie. And so I always need to tell my audiences this. It's like, don't think like yourself. Think like the average person, right? The average person only intermittently pays attention to politics. It's rational, right? They've got a lot going on in the world. They want, they have their work, they have their family, they have their hobbies. And so, among the people who are paying attention, right, these are the folks who politics is their hobby. But let's think about the people like the average person, the person who it isn't. Social media, you might join for a variety of reasons because you want to link in with your friends. Like you want to see, I love, pictures of my friends' kids and like my friends' kids going to college and, sort of different things. Or, I like watching sports. And so I might learn about, sort of here's a clip from the game last night, right? And so that most people are engaged in social media for that reason. But what about the kinds of people who are on there, but incidentally come across political content, right? So it's not the people who are posting, here's the latest about this particular political rumor. Like, here's why, here's something about Obama having 26 different social security numbers, or here's something about Donald Trump, being in the pocket of the Russian government. But they might see that, like, I didn't know that. There's something going on there. It gets back to what we were talking earlier about these people who say that they're not sure, right? So, going in, I guess that this gets at the same sort of thing we were talking about before. We're talking about sort of targeting misinformation with information. Going in, I thought, like, I'm going to try to convince these people who hold these beliefs how we can give them up. And like realizing, like, that's really hard. And so instead, focusing on these people who say that they're not sure is, in some ways, it's a softer target. That we are, different ways that we can address them, that we can affect them. But also, it's a bigger target there, right? Because it's the people who, so I don't worry about so the relative who is deep into conspiracy theories, it's like, there's not much I can do about them. But, my other relatives who don't pay attention to politics, over here, this relative, like, there's something there, right? And so that becomes their political exposure. And so in social media, I join to see pictures of my friends, my friends' kids. But as the course of doing this, I'll see something in my feed about political rumors or about politics. And, I might just kind of plant that seed there. So I think that that's what's really dangerous, kind of this what I call this incidental exposure to political information among people who aren't, sort of aren't predisposed to find that kind of information. But if that's what they get, then we can have this uncertainty, this skepticism that can be really bad for democracy.
Well, and one thing, kind of bringing up of getting exposure to this incidental information is that social media is a place where it's really difficult to figure out the extent of somebody's expertise, right? When somebody shares something on social media, it could be that they're making it up, or it could be that they are the genuine, true expert who like did the thing and did the research. How much does the ambiguity of the source on social media shape how we view the information and basically our susceptibility to political rumors?
Yeah, I mean, that gets at this is larger question we touched on earlier, the question of expertise, right? Who gets to be an expert, right? So kind of thinking about what I mentioned before about fact checkers, so fact checkers are people who are trained journalists, right? Who are trained to see, like, is there evidence out there to support this claim that someone is making, or are they not supported there? And so, we think that expertise should be self-reinforcing. you and I are both university professors, right? And so we think like, oh, when it comes to politics and political science and human behavior, people should listen to us. But that's true across all different sorts of fields. And we've seen this in medical fields as well, sort of folks who, ordinary folks who say like, do your own research, right? Don't necessarily take the doctor's sort of advice at face value. So I think there's been a diminishment of the value of expertise, as expertise in, sort of in favor of, sort of doing your own research and kind of, and a part of doing your own research is finding someone who says what you believe that's in line with your beliefs and saying like, ah, that's the authority. So I think you're pointing to this larger issue of, in a time when sort of authority of all kinds are being questioned, how can we marshal evidence in a way that people believe? And I think that is a huge challenge. Yeah, no, I mean, like this is very depressing. It's a very depressing conversation. People, so it's like, yeah, if you want to have a fun party, don't invite a political scientist to talk about politics. But I think, like in many ways, a lot of what my book is about are the, sort of the challenges and why it's really hard to correct misinformation and why it's really hard to get everyone on the same page. So in the conclusion, I had 3 or 4 starts where I'm like, I don't want to end on a depressing note, but then I moved to another depressing note, and I think that is here. But I think it is a big problem. Now that said, there is some potential hope there, right? In terms of thinking about how can we get the message of the experts out, and so that gets at kind of thinking about one of the strategies I talk about in the book is different strategies for correcting misinformation and correcting rumors is like basically how can we use trusted sources to do that?
So, actually, speaking of these trusted sources, right? And one thing that often comes up with these idea of trusted sources, or at least trusted outlets, is this question about the media sort of beyond social media, and the mainstream media, the news generally. But one thing that we see kind of happening with the media is that it's actually becoming increasingly more fragmented. People can find something that looks like the news in many more spaces. And there's increasingly just a total decline in editorial gatekeeping, which means that people can just publish things out there. One thing that I'm thinking about is a platform like Substack, where the author can publish a newsletter directly, sometimes amass like thousands upon thousands, up to millions of people who will listen to them and sort of feel like they're getting actually some really special, important, privileged information that they wouldn't get elsewhere. Um, what does this change in how some people, especially people who are especially interested in politics, get information mean for the emergence of things that are maybe, if not political rumors, at least to me seem political rumor adjacent?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, again, it gets at this question, like, who are these people who are, combing through Substack and looking for the like-minded sources? These are political junkies, right? These are people who really, they might be, well, I'd say they're misguided political junkies, right? But they're in it, right? And that's their hobby, right? Kind of looking at these sorts of sources of information. And so I'd say like that's really important to recognize that these people who are kind of pulling out this information are unusual, but they interact in the larger media ecosystem there, right? So again, thinking going back to incidental exposure, that the true believers are dangerous, not necessarily. I mean, there is right sort of danger of radicalization, but they're dangerous for ordinary people because they take this information that is generated in these kind of smaller communities and give it a larger audience, right? So you can think about some examples of that. So the QAnon, right? The kind of these political conspiracies and rumors that, sort of the Democrat politicians are, sort of trying to drain the blood of young kids and they're trafficking people, they're sex trafficking and other sorts of trafficking, right? Kind of like all these kinds of crazy stories. That started on these Reddits, right? Kind of these small communities, but kind of broke into the larger ecosystem where you had the New York Times writing about it there. And so that's the worry, I think, is that it's not just that, that people without authority are, so as you said, right, these aren't trained journalists necessarily. There's not the credentialing of an expert, but they can generate information. And then you get other people who are these true believers who are bringing it out into the larger information ecosystem, and that's potentially problematic. So in the book, I think about it, kind of an analogy of a pebble in a pond, right? Kind of thinking about ripples of belief. You have the people who are, sort of the people who are all in on the conspiracy theories, um, that, they receive them. You have someone who creates them, drops a pebble in a pond. You have the people really close by who think like, yeah, no, this is the truth. And as the ripples go out, at the outer edge are the people who don't believe the rumor, who are saying basically, yeah, there's no evidence to support this. I don't believe this. But in the middle, you have, again, those people who say that they're not sure, right? The people who are incidentally exposed to these beliefs that could be very dangerous there. But, again, thinking, what is the solution there, right? The solution is not to shut down, Substack or just say like we can't have the generation of information, right? The thing is that we want to think about separating out the message from the messenger, right? And so I think that this is an important thing to think about is that, sort of when I first started doing talks about my work back in 2010, 2011, I would say, you think that the solution is fact checkers, right? And so basically, there's misinformation, there's a political rumor there. Bring in a fact checker, an expert to say this isn't true. And people will listen to these nonpartisan experts. But again, as I mentioned with my relative, right, you can change your view of the information, which is kind of was the hope, or you can change your view of the person delivering that message, right? And so fact checkers like, oh, it's just liberal garbage. I'm not going to listen to that. So I think what's important is to think about how we can separate out expertise, right? And thinking about the people deciding, is this supported or not? From the messenger, right? The person delivering that message. So I think fact checkers are great. I think that fact checking is a really important industry. Right? Thinking about having serious people trying to, sort of see, are these different claims supported by the evidence? But it's very clear these are not the best people to deliver that message there, right? So I think the key is take the message from the fact checker and have it delivered by someone who is a trusted source there, right? And so, thinking like how can we push back against, the fact that in the current day and age, that basically anyone has a platform and they can write anything that they want. I think the key is to take the information that is well supported, right? And again, this isn't things that like I'm not saying we want to spread information about things that I believe, but thinking about what are the standards of evidence, the standards of publicly available evidence at a given moment in time to think, okay, what is the message that we want to send here and have a different messenger, right? So thinking, here's an example, like during early days of COVID, in minority communities, there was concern about sort of vaccines, and for good reason. Going back to the Tuskegee experiments, where the U.S. government injected African American men with syphilis, right? And so it's like, wow, maybe those aren't trusted there. So the idea is not to say have doctors come in and say like, oh, this is good, right? Getting the COVID shot is good because there's an inherent skepticism, right? Instead, have community leaders, right? People who are trusted in a given community. So religious leaders, thinking about other sorts of community organizers saying like, hey, this is good for our community there. So I think so we're thinking about part of the solution is recognizing that, that there are no like self-enforcing corrections, right? It's not that like I assert like, oh, I'm an expert, so people should listen to me. I often, thinking about it, MIT, scientific evidence. I sometimes talk to colleagues in other departments and they say, I'm a scientist at MIT. Like people should listen to me. And so like, well, they should, you are the expert, but it doesn't mean that they're going to. That in some ways, if I say, this comes from a scientist at MIT that's like, oh, I'm not going to believe that, right? Or, a doctor saying, vaccines are good for you. It's very important for public health. So like, oh, of course they're going to say that. They're just in the pocket of big pharma, right? So I think kind of thinking about what are the solutions, and I guess that this is like the somewhat hopeful part of my book is thinking about how can we separate these processes, right? Thinking about the experts who determine whether or not something is supported by the evidence, and then the people that we marshal to deliver that message, and just kind of thinking creatively about that.
Well, this actually gets us to this question of who can correct. And as you notice, one of the most challenging parts of the book.
Yeah,
And this idea that potentially, in theory, there is a very limited range of actors or people who could correct a rumor. And
yeah.
one of the kind of types of people you bring up is what I'll call like a surprising actor. So, for
Mhm,
example, a politician from a political party that actually benefits from a rumor saying, well, actually, this thing is not true.
mhm.
And I'm kind of wondering about the limit to this type of correction. So
Yeah,
you make this correction once and it's really powerful. And then you make it again and potentially again. Um, is it not surprising anymore? Is it kind of a one-time thing? Is there a reputational component to it?
yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great point. In the book, the specific example I talk about is thinking about rumors about death panels in healthcare. So the Affordable Care Act, had provisions about end of life directives, like basically, talk to your doctor. That Medicare would pay for discussions with your doctor about how do you, sort of end of life issues. And then this became morphed into, right, there's death panels that are going to decide whether or not, your grandmother lives or dies there, right? And so this became a source of misinformation, this political rumor there. And so the question is, like, who's the best person to correct that, right? Well, thinking, maybe it's an expert, maybe it's the American Medical Association or the American Association of Retired People, right? So that's kind of the traditional thing is bring in a nonpartisan expert and have them correct that. Now, I found is that worked, but not as well as a case of having a Republican politician, so in this case, John Isaacson, who co-authored the end of life provisions, saying, like, you might have heard that this is crazy. You might have heard this, but that's a crazy rumor. Like, it doesn't hold. And it's a Republican who's speaking against the party's interests, right? A Republican who says, you might have heard this rumor about this Democratic policy. It's not true, right? And so it's right, this surprising thing. So someone speaking against their apparent interest. Another example I can think of I often talk about is thinking about, I'm old enough, and I think you are too, yeah, to remember when McDonald's sold supersized fries, right? So this was a product, so maybe not, but anyway, there was a product back in the 90s that McDonald's sold French fries that were supersized. It was basically two large fries put together. And at some point, McDonald's stopped selling this. Like, McDonald's never said, don't eat so many French fries. But if a company that makes its money selling French fries stops selling a product, it's like, maybe you shouldn't, right? You could create your own supersized fries by putting two together, two larges together. But like, don't do that, right? So again, kind of thinking about that. And so I think that that's what's really good is thinking creatively about instances where it's unexpected information, right? And so this is another case of a good way to deliver a message, as I said before, about thinking about trusted sources. But you raise an excellent point, right? Which is like it works, potentially well once, but is it a case of the boy who cries wolf, right? Where you say it once, people listen, and people start tuning it out. Is it, a case of, like liking to banner blindness, so thinking about like when pop-ups come, you pay attention, and eventually it's like, this again there. But actually, it's even worse than that potentially, right? So thinking about, someone who delivers a message against their apparent interest, I can change my view of the information. I can change my view of that person. So think about Liz Cheney, right, as someone who's a very, right, so, right, the daughter of the former vice president, a very prominent Republican politician, high in leadership, spoke out against Trump's claims about the 2020 election. She like essentially like this is right, this is just not true, right? The election was not stolen. Right. So that's actually the perfect kind of person there to think about, right, as that is the ideal corrector, right? Someone mainstream Republican with the pedigree of the party saying, like, this is just not true. Now, what happened in the end there is people changed their view of Liz Cheney, right? That she became a rhino, right? And she was seen as a target where not only was she not listened to, she's basically forced out of the Republican Party there. So, what I would say is that the solution is not just to look at these surprising correctors, but that we really need to think about a broad base of people who can do the correcting. But again, the key is to separate out the message from the messenger, right? And thinking about how can we do that and just being creative. So, you know, to say, like I say, like, oh, we need to have Republicans saying all these rumors are bunk. Like, well, okay, that was one thing that worked back in 2010. Maybe it doesn't work today, but we need to think more creatively about the messenger. So that's my hope is that people take away from the book is not like, well, Republicans, politicians could have corrected Republican rumors, but now that just doesn't work anymore. Think like, okay, no, we want to think about who's the most effective messenger for a particular message.
So thinking about these corrections sort of even more broadly, so beyond politicians, in a recent Pew survey, about 70% of people who use TikTok said that they sometimes see inaccurate news on the platform. Um, this percentage was basically similar for people on Instagram, slightly higher for people on Facebook.
Mhm.
We see people saying things that we think are wrong or think are actually potentially untrue all the time. You mentioned the example of a family dinner where this is happening. And I think sometimes um, somebody listening to this might feel compelled to correct what they see as somebody espousing a political rumor. On the
Mhm.
other hand, we hate being corrected, right? Like my kids hated me correcting them about Taylor Swift lyrics that were obviously incorrect, right? We don't
Mhm.
like when somebody comes in and corrects us about anything.
Yeah.
So if somebody ever feels faced with something that is they perceive as a rumor and they feel compelled to correct, are there
Mhm.
any conditions under which this could be effective? Or is this kind of just designed as a recipe to make things worse?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think your analogy to parenting is very good. As the parent of two, well, actually one teenager, one 20-year-old, right? It's sort of basically telling like you should listen to me because I'm the parent. Like that just doesn't work well, right? So think about different other strategies that you could use. Think about like basically trying to get the good information out there, right? So not saying, oh, that's wrong, here's the truth. It's like, huh, that's interesting. This is, have you looked at this sort of, this alternative viewpoint there, right? So again, not saying you're wrong, but trying to kind of more gently get that out there. And so again, I'm thinking about, different parenting mistakes I made because I was more the like, you're wrong, this is right, but thinking like, if I had to do it again, right, just kind of getting people or your kids to think it's their own idea that they should look into this. Like, sort of, if you see, sort of TikTok videos, which my kids do, and especially my teenage daughter, it's sort of like, how can we get her on sort of a different sort of feed, right, where she might see other things. So I think, basically, as you said, you know, telling people that they're wrong is not very effective. And the louder you say it, right, the better you feel, but it doesn't make it any more effective. So I think, again, thinking about how we can kind of not just correct misinformation, but sort of having those same trusted sources, those same credible sources delivering information maybe without a correction, right? So not saying, in the case of, COVID-19 shots, not saying you might have heard that this is a government conspiracy, but just talking more about the positive parts. Saying it's really important for our community that we do this. Now, again, the problem is that there's no magic solution. So I talked to lots of different government groups, I talked to different policy groups, and they all say, well, what can we do? And what I always tell people is, like, I know you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the problem and here's the three simple solutions to the misinformation problem or the political rumor problem. And so I'm not going to do that because that doesn't exist. And anyone who tells you that there is such a solution is a snake oil salesman and you should run away, right? This is a really tricky, hard problem. And so, a lot of what I've been trying to do is getting people excited about small effects, right? Can I move people's beliefs a couple percentage points? Can I decrease a little the sharing of false information? And so I think when ordinary people, like when folks are thinking about when you encounter misinformation in real life, recognize you're not going to be able to fix it, right? Just snapping your fingers. If it is, we wouldn't be where we are today. But thinking about what are some different strategies that you could employ, different ways that you could talk about it that might have a little impact at the margin, right? And getting, again, sort of like I want to get people excited about small effects, right? Because thinking about what is so I'll go all social scientific here, talk about counterfactuals, like what is the situation where sort of what is that counterfactual? Like what is the alternative universe? The alternative universe to people have in mind is we have the current situation, bad information, and there's some universe out there where I can snap my fingers and make misinformation go away. And so I'm going to keep going, keep pushing until I find that alternative universe. I find that solution. I was like, you're never going to find it. So instead, be happy with these where we can have some small effects, right? Because the counterfactual to the current situation is not one in which the solution is just around the corner. Now, we've been at this for many years, not just myself, but social scientists in general, right? We know there is no solution there, right? There's no single fix. There's no magic bullet. So, let's live in that counterfactual world where we could have people just changing their beliefs at the margin, right? And that's a better world than the world we live in now. And so I guess that sort of to kind of end on a somewhat, I guess, as happy a note as I can, but thinking about like we want to push for that world.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an interesting book that raises like so many nuanced points, especially about kind of thinking about these things as a social science dilemma with no kind of
So I should
immediate
like I have my copy too. It's
Yeah.
coming out in paperback very shortly, and so for folks who are interested, my Princeton Press would want me to do that.
Well, thank you.
Great, thanks.